All right, episode 53 of In Good Faith. This is the start of the second year of this particular show, podcast. To help me make sense of everything that has happened and is happening and might be about to happen, I have with me my good friend, Farzan Parupia. Farzan, why don't you introduce yourself and then, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Iqbal. It's great to be here. Many people may not know that we work together, or we have been working together since 2021, before Ramadan that year. I worked on Transform My Prayer together that Ramadan, launching it. And then we worked full-time. I worked full-time with you for a couple of years after that. And then we went our separate ways. And here we are, a couple of years later, reunited. So I hope that this is a fruitful conversation today, as well as future episodes. And interestingly, I was with you in person in London. I'm in Dallas, Texas, US, but I was with you for episode 1 of In Good Faith. I was with you for episode 30 of In Good Faith. And now I'm with you for episode 53 of In Good Faith. So it's pretty awesome.
Cool. All right. What are we doing today then?
Honestly, I'm here to just hear your ideas, your journey, where you are, what's led you up to this point. Over the years, you've had many different things happening. So just trying to really understand kind of the steps in your journey, the whys, the whats, etc., and then where you are now and what you want to do next.
Cool. So where shall I begin?
Well, let's start with In Good Faith. It's been 52 episodes for you. And it was interesting because in one of your presentations, you explained how you wanted to go from monologue and teaching to dialogue and actually interacting with others and hearing others' ideas, perhaps to develop your own ideas even further. So what would you say are your biggest, maybe top 3 lessons that you've learned over the past year? And why have you now decided to once again go back to a semi-monologue? Because this is mostly going to be you speaking, I would say, but it's somewhat of a dialogue, but you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, well, I suppose the number one lesson is just a personal one, which is I am clearly quite a volatile individual in terms of my motivations, intentions. And I think that's just because I may be overly so, but I do introspect a lot and try to think about what the point of what I'm doing actually is. And if I feel that adjustments are needed, then I make those adjustments. As you might recall, and as I think maybe some people might recall, when I actually started the podcast, initially, well, the road leading up to the podcast starting was for me to think about what is a way for me to be able to share my ideas on social media. Because up until that point, primarily, I wasn't really social media active. I have a personal resistance to being on social media, to be honest with you. But yeah, I was thinking about, okay, look, I've done all these courses, like you mentioned earlier, and how can I just start to share some ideas on social media? And I thought I work best in conversation, right? Rather than just direct to camera with nobody there. Some people can do that. I struggle with that, really. I feel like I need a real human being on the other side of it. And so that's why the first few episodes were me being hosted at that time by Taimur Abdal, who kindly hosted the first few episodes. I did about 6 of them overall. And that was good. And that helped me just share some of my thoughts, but also my questions. Whenever I express my opinions, I usually express them quite strongly and with conviction, but at the same time, they're generally loosely held. And then one thing which maybe people don't know or realize is that I take my thinking and my ideas, I take very personally, meaning all of this is a very personal journey. It's a very personal exercise. And so I would say my mood is very much correlated oftentimes to the existential questions that I'm posing of myself. And then to the extent that I feel I have clarity, I feel elated. And to the extent I feel I don't understand what's going on, I can get quite down. And so there was a time, maybe various factors were coming together where I felt, okay, I've spoken enough now. Like, I'm tired of speaking. I've been teaching and speaking for decades, frankly speaking, right? Even from being a teenager. And so I got tired of it. And then I thought, okay, yes, now I'm just going to let me actually get onto properly inviting guests and listening. And that happened sooner than I thought it would, because I had a rough idea for the first year that maybe I would be monologuing, or essentially for half of them, and then maybe the second half of the year would be actually maybe having guests on. But it switched faster than I thought. And then, but at certain points, 2-3 times into the journey, I felt I felt the urge to speak about something, and I came back out of the woodwork to kind of say my piece. But otherwise, yeah, then I was just hosting and questioning. So the first lesson really is listen to yourself, like pay attention to where you're at, and maybe don't get caught up in plans that you've made or even significant external commitments if those aren't working anymore, and then shift accordingly. The idea of going with the flow. And generally, I am a go with the flow kind of person. I think increasingly over the last year, I've become increasingly such a person where I am much more present in relation to my day-to-day life, my projects, and also have internalized more the folly of like hard commitments and plans and even objectives to a certain degree, yeah, in a specific way. So that would be the number one. Number two, I would say, is that listening is an art, paying attention is an art. Each of the episodes that went out, on average, I will have watched each of them 3 or 4 times in the process of editing, reviewing, timestamping, etc. And on each listen, even on the third listen, I would gather something that I didn't even remember was even said in the first place in the conversation. So, like deep listening, for me, that's something I have had to get better at, listening with a view to understanding rather than listening with a view to responding. Because again, all my life I've been more an opinionated person trying to get across what I think, what I have to say. Definitely open to lots of different ideas. I mean, in that sense, I'm a synthesizer. I don't necessarily consider myself overly an original thinker, like more like I try to just synthesize all of the things that I am looking at in order to try to come up with answers to the questions that I'm posing. So anyway, that's something which is work in progress. And then the third one would be, and maybe this is why I want to spend a few episodes just really sharing where I'm at on certain critical questions, what I think are important critical questions that I've been asking myself for many years, is that I do feel that there is, I mean, this is just generally across the board anyway in society, but certainly within the community, the contemporary community that considers itself in some way representative of the revelatory prophetic tradition from 7th century Arabia, right? That I just think there's a lot of confusion. In recent times, I've been saying, actually, I don't even know if there is such a thing that we can call, quote unquote, the Muslim community, even though, like, I have, as you know, and as many know, I have objections to, which we'll end up talking about, I'm sure, just the usage of these, call it religious terminologies, let's say. But I'm not even sure there is such a thing, really. And there's a lot of confusion. And I feel that there is not coherence within people and across people, whether they're practitioners or even sometimes scholars, academics, with regards to what I would call overarching approaches to knowledge, understanding in such a way that's actually going to afford pragmatic solutions to actually deal with the issues of the day in a way that solves or synthesizes or brings together the, what you might call the authenticity component as well as the relevance components within a neat kind of system. Yeah. That is something it feels like we are badly struggling with. And I think partly I want to, although I have done to certain bits here and there, I want to frankly be helped, hopefully by yourself, to get across where I'm at on various questions, to provoke, therefore, hopefully conversation dialogue in the broadest sense with others who may be following this show. And then for my public and private persona presentation, thoughts and ideas to actually become aligned. Because I think there's a lot that I've been thinking about and looking at behind the scenes in the last year or two, which I haven't necessarily shared. And that's just been because usually I'll try to develop certain things or explore certain things and then bring them into my public dialogue when I feel that they are settled enough or internalized enough. And there's a combination there of, like, again, strong opinions, speculations, but they're things that I want to be doing that thinking in public. So to be a lot more open about the things that I'm exploring and the questions that I think are important, challenging as they are, tough as they might be, but really important ones, I think. And I want to always, at the beginning of this, throughout the first year of this podcast, there was always the intention to, mature the online space in terms of the kind of dialogue and conversation that is being had in such a way that is hopefully rigorous to a degree, but also where we're able to have open conversations on difficult questions and topics, and not in such a way where it is causing like division and people are shouting each other down or excluding or excommunicating each other, which is how often takes place and happens. But rather one where it kind of there's a respectful dialogue and respectful of the fact that there's a shared objective, which is to frankly figure out what is true, what is good, what works, what is beautiful, what is wise, what makes sense for us to do, and also critically, like, what is universal. I think universality, as you know, is a really big component of how I try to think about things, and as opposed to being insular and as opposed to just thinking in what you might call sort of Muslim speak or internal speak, but no, how are we actually presenting on a much more global and universal basis? So that's the third thing, and that's why I think I'm looking forward to maybe this, again, however long, kind of series of episodes where you can help me kind of get myself up to date in public, but also push me to the limits of where I'm at, and for us to identify gaps, and then maybe I can evolve my own thinking in relation to those gaps.
Sounds great. Thanks for sharing that. So if you were to put your theory of change, or your kind of what your main objective or purpose is at this point in your journey, for example, a few years ago, and for a time period of a few years, your thing was to help people live a truly God-centered life, to help people achieve clarity through revelation, and you have to remind me of the others, connection through prayer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah. So
And
I mean,
courage through
there's various
leadership.
iterations. Yeah. Yeah. Even at the time
Yeah.
when I was in charge of National Zakat Foundation, we were thinking about visions and sort of statements to capture like what the actual overarching objective is here in the broader sense, or a vision. Yeah. There's been various iterations, right? So at times it's been for devotion to God to flourish in society as a source of prosperity and harmony for all. And then, partly kind of mission vision and mission related then is the idea of helping people achieve connection through prayer,
Mm.
display courage in leadership, clarity through revelation, and all of that being part and parcel of like but sort of manifesting a God-centered life. Again, some of these terminologies and phrases, it's not that I don't consider them to be appropriate in terms of what I'm trying to do now, but I interpret them differently even for myself. What I even mean by that, right?
Mm.
So most lately, and on my and even on my channel at the moment, I've got something like the idea is just to have a space where we can cultivate wisdom and enable transformation. And
Mm.
in a way, it's more processual or process oriented as opposed to objective oriented.
Mm.
I feel like so one thing I feel is that what's important is to have the right orientation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because actually, if I was to add a fourth lesson, it's like the realization of how much you don't know, or or aware
Mm.
of. Yeah. So that's a big thing. I think just most people just don't know how much they don't know, and the blind spots. Yeah. And our blind spots, I think, are like immense, obviously. And therefore, actually, I came up with something which just as a reminder for myself, just to help me with an orientation, like just to see like, okay, how am I orienting myself? And the idea was I coined it as the wow factor. Okay. So WOW. So the first W is for wonder. You see, everything begins with wonder. Everything begins with a certain type of amazement, a curiosity. And there's like this idea of a radical amazement, right? About like just even bewilderment at the fact of existence at all, at the fact that there are facts at all, and that we're having this embodied experience that we're having. And just to understand like what even is this that's happening, and then
Mm.
obviously everything around us. So oftentimes, usually when we speak about wonder, we might be thinking, oh, wonder at nature. Yeah, and that's obviously significant and important. But there's almost like a more fundamental wonder, which is almost when you wake up, like to be like, what the heck kind of thing. There is a like, that is something just to be alive, right? And to
Mhm.
in the way that we are. So that's first thing. And then second one, the O is openness. Yeah, or openness, open-mindedness. It is to open ourselves up to and want to be further opened up to experience. Part of the reason why this is a product of, but also part of the reason why I'm so resistant to labels and adjectives that close our frame. So even if you're talking to somebody on an individual basis, right? People say oftentimes, I am this kind of person, right? Now, even in a therapeutic sense or in a counseling sense, let's say, usually an advice or a thought for this person to think about is whether they are, by applying an adjective or a kind of label for themselves, even though lowercase in this particular case, that they are impacting their internal sort of cognitive framing or architecture in
Mhm.
such a way that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah, I'm a lazy
Mm.
person.
Yeah.
Uh, I'll always be that, right? And so this is a closing frame. Similarly, then
Mm.
political labeling, yeah, which doesn't allow us to see, which doesn't just become a loose way of a convention just to describe an orientation, but becomes
Mm.
over time a tribal affiliation. And then I think something because I belong to that.
Mm.
Not I think something so I belong to that. And this applies
Mm.
into religious labeling, political, all sorts. So openness is a frame breaking type of thing. And then it links to this idea of presence. There's a healthy thing about forgetting everything that's happened so far and just meeting experience in a fresh way and
Mhm.
to go from scratch. Like, to the nth degree, there's an idea and a benefit of almost being so present that that's almost like becomes a continuum in how you actually live and how you process and engage with the world, which I think there's something to be said for. And then the third one is what I've mentioned in W is wisdom. I think these two are almost necessary components of wisdom. And then wisdom is a word which I've been using increasingly recently, which maybe I wasn't using as much before in quite the same way, because actually it just really captures, like, when people have a proposal, an idea, a thought about, again, it could be to do with religious practice, it could be just with to the day-to-day life or whatever. We ask ourselves different questions, maybe implicitly or otherwise, about what kind of course of behavior is it, or action is this? Does it make sense? Is it authentic, etc.? But the word wise just seems to just capture everything.
Mm.
Like, is it wise? And it's interesting, of course, that one of the most oft repeated divine names in the Revelation is Al-Hakim, the most wise. One of the most common adjectives for the Revelation itself is that it is the wise scripture or revelation, depending on what translation you want to go for. And then it also suggests that essentially relatively few people are given or have wisdom, but whoever has been given wisdom has been given a lot. And I think wisdom
Mm.
is what we're all in pursuit of and in need of. So yeah, I think
Mm.
it's still the same stuff in some sense, with truth, goodness, as I said, beauty, wisdom, connection, transformation. All these things are paramount, but it's more an
Mm.
orientation now to keep going on a journey where we can sort of develop that. And hopefully, so the idea for me is to share my perspectives, but also hopefully to have it such that those people who are participating in this journey contribute to that process. And yeah, if there's any benefit in any of this, then they bring that into their own practice, they bring that into their institutions, they bring that into the organizations and the various spheres of influence that they have too.
Mm. My response is, wow. No, I thanks for sharing that. I mean, as you know, I love frameworks. I love taking ideas and putting them into a simple, easy to digest framework. So wonder, openness, and wisdom. And the wonder, the first W, I think another W that goes along with that is why, WHY, because obviously wonder, why, you're kind of thinking, okay, trying to make sense of things essentially. And also, yeah, there's so many thoughts I have, but just two thoughts. One is that I've said before that I feel like life is just at the core of it, at the crux of it, it's just two things, which is humility and then trying your best, and or vice versa, trying your best and just having humility, because at the end of the day, that's the most we can do, is just to try our best to make sense of things in terms of belief, in terms of practice, and then to just be humble as well. It kind of, those 2 points maybe kind of go along with what you said. Another thing that comes to mind, point number two for me, more a reflection is, you mentioned like essentially this concept of binary thinking versus spectrum thinking. If a person asks or says, "Oh, I'm lazy," that's a statement based on the binary, meaning, am I lazy or am I not lazy? And I think often we fall into the binary thinking where we make statements not realizing it's not black or white, even though we treat it as black and white. We speak of it as those black and white, but it's really a spectrum. So it's not, am I lazy or am I not? It's how lazy am I? It's not, am I handsome or not? It's how handsome am I? How handsome am I? How smart am I? And so even applied to what you said, that came to my mind because I think sometimes we think of things as just a binary, Muslim, not Muslim, this, that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, excellent. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. So the almost always, and I find myself saying a lot in private conversations, sometimes in some of the teaching I've done online as well in recent months, that yeah, just challenging these false binaries, like really important ones actually, which are central to the malaise of the modern age, right? The mind body, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a false
That's right.
binary. Fact and
Yeah.
value, science and
Mm.
religion. Okay.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
Oftentimes
Deen or
when it,
dunya.
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So there's so many of these actually. And this is almost what some have spoken about, which is to do with this idea of left brain thinking, right? Left brain thinking is basically where you want to try to, our need to categorize. Yeah. We
Mm.
need to
Yeah.
categorize, to label. I need to know where I stand relative to this thing. What is it?
Mm.
So this,
Yeah.
and so I need to I need to know, is it this? Is it that? And the right brain thinking, again, I'm no expert on this. It's something I'm trying to increase my understanding and knowledge of, but is well, basically essentially would complement that, or kind of loosen those frames, right? Or look at things slightly differently. Even when somebody says, is this true or false? Do you believe A or B?
Mm.
Oftentimes true or false is not even the relevant, it's not even the helpful
Right.
framework to use. Like sometimes, maybe we'll come onto it later, either today or subsequently. When somebody says, is, like, even if they say, is the Quran true or false?
Mm.
it's just the wrong question, in
Mm.
my opinion. And this relates to another point, which is related to the binary. The binary, there's a binary in terms of subject object as well. So, for example, when it comes to the interpretation of Revelation, which is a big thing, or just a big topic that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I suppose engaged in for ages, is that it's just this realization, which again is stating the obvious, but really important to remind ourselves of, is that there's no Quran out there that exists objectively with an objective set of meanings, right? It's as soon as anyone engages with it, you're already in a subject-object loop, basically. So it is a participatory engagement. So the issue isn't is it true or
Mm.
false. The issue is what are you deriving from it? What filters are you applying to it in terms of to draw from it or anything else, frankly speaking, yeah. And then and how coherent and consistent is that framework, and how is it then fitted to your current context, right? So there's all this participation going between loads of different things happening. So this looping type of understanding again helps to deal with this binary thing. And then what your first point, which is again very very important and correct, which is the emphasis on the humility side, again really relates to this as well, because you appreciate the subjectivity of your engagement, and therefore an insistence on a certain approach or a certain way, and then an in-group, out-group type of mentality, it becomes very, very dangerous. And then it comes back to the whole thing, closing your frames, the way your mind then starts to interact, with experience and everything else, can become very, just damaging in lots of ways, actually. So
Yeah.
yeah, and this is why, like, one thing just to say one more thing here, which is to say that a big theme of the last year, again, through some of the conversations in the podcast, but just again through lots of private conversations as well, is lots of things to do with like breaking molds. Yeah. I learned a certain type of thing, a discipline in a certain kind of way. And then you realize you look outside of it, there's a lot more. And then that's challenging, right? Because that's challenging your whole construct, your worldview. So for me, that I've been doing that over and over and over again, like for a long time now. Yeah. And frankly, like, yeah, in the early or middle stages of that, until relatively recently, I'll say that's a really disorienting and difficult process. But that's why, in a sense, I think you're left with this wow factor as the only possible approach that makes any sense. It's a constant openness then, and a constant wonder, because as soon as you are going to close yourself into a frame to say, now I've arrived, yeah, something will come and smash that or break it or challenge it. So it's this, and in a way, I think there's some that I hope that is this is therefore this is a more godly way to be, in the
Yeah.
sense that if you're trying to arrive, relate to, appreciate, experience the unfathomable, then as soon as you think you've got something, that you've fathomed it all, basically, you're going away from where you need to get to.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, there's many thoughts here again. So one is actually from something earlier you said, which is, the fact that the more you learn, the more you explore, the more you wonder, the more you realize you don't know anything. So it's almost like the way I think about it visually is that, let's say that you have 100%, which is your body of knowledge. And basically your knowledge is, let's just say, 5% of that full in terms of like what you actually know, right? Let's say there's 100% knowledge out there, 5%. But now when you take that knowledge from 100% to like 200%, so you get to know more, you realize your 5% is a smaller fraction of the whole. And the bigger the whole gets, the smaller your actual piece in that whole gets. So you realize actually, like you become humble, you think of yourself even less in terms of what you know. I don't know if that analogy or that visual made sense, but so that's one thought. The other thing is in terms of the whole binary and spectrum thinking, I just want to make sure like I understand correctly and we're on the same page. So one binary or spectrum is when there's one idea and you can look at it from either a spectrum or binary, right? It's not all in, it's not all or nothing. It's most of the time it's somewhere in the middle. That's a spectrum, right? So that's in relation to one thing. But then there's also a spectrum in relation to what you mentioned, which is subject and object, right? Could you explain that one more time?
Yeah, it's another duality, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Where it's basically
Yeah.
where, look, what is the objective reality out there separate from myself? Because I'm the only one
Mm.
through which I'm seeing things, right? It's
Yes.
not completely
Yes.
subjective. It's not complete in the sense that it's not that there is nothing, like there's nothing real, right? Or really real out there. And it's just all a total hallucination. But maybe the way to think about it is like a transjective, yeah,
Hmm.
which is then says this it's a constant participatory thing. So just that's
Right,
to
right,
do with
right.
my
Got it.
day-to-day interaction with existence and life and what have you. But especially in hermeneutical or interpretive attempts, right? Where
Yeah.
you just to have that humility. So that, again, when people have an insistence on certain thing, and especially again in religious type of contexts, when opinions or statements are invoked as this is like objective truth, the
Right, right, right.
subjectivity of the individual and the individuals and the processes that led up to are
Yes,
just
yes.
completely sidelined. Okay, so this is
That's a good point.
so the
Yes.
appreciation of like the appreciation of the human, the mind, the thing that's being interacted with, and then the broader context. And if we're going to get to this wisdom thing, we are going to individually and collectively have to be constantly triangulating between these if we want things
Mm.
to make any
Yes.
sense,
Right.
right?
Got it.
That's kind of
So perfect. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So there's essentially three things. One is just in terms of spectrum. One is just the same topic, you're looking at it binary versus spectrum. One is what you just mentioned in terms of almost like objective, subjective, and how you see things. And then the third is kind of mutual exclusivity, which is like sometimes we think that things are exclusive, deen, dunya, political parties, whatever else. And then we put labels on those things. And then it's almost like we've put ourselves into this sort of bubble or cage. And it's like we're not able to then properly interact with, or they're almost like then you remove the wonder part of it almost, right? Or the openness part of it. Like pretty much the wow is kind of gone when you apply kind of this restrictive thinking. So that's the three. And yeah, the point you made about the whole, the way any individual looks at the world, any opinion that they derive, anything that they may even consider truth or fact, is that ultimately there's so much that has led to them coming to that conclusion, including their upbringing, their family, their background, nature, nurture, everything has led them to that. So, so would you say that there is such a thing as objective truth?
I mean, like the, the thing is, whatever I answer about that, how is it helpful is a question, right? At the end of the day, because I think it's situational. I said that's why I'm just more interested in what's situational things, right?
So
Like
just to give you an
like
example,
as
just
in
to
real for me, what I could say, like, yeah, go on, give an example then.
oh, sorry, I think there's a bit of a lag, but yeah, I would say, let's say there's one God, right? God exists and he is one. Let's just use that as kind of a,
Okay.
let's say, okay, is that we believe, if I say that, okay, I believe that's an objective truth, regardless of your subjective outlook, opinion, background, would you say that that's a correct statement in terms of an objective truth?
Yeah. Well, and this is where some of my friends have criticized me when I've spoken to them privately, which is that no one seems to like the "it depends" answer. Yeah. Because you see, it's so interesting, right? Well, I think it's interesting. Okay. So maybe we're getting to one of I suppose, the main topics where I've been kind of thinking a lot about, because ultimately, whichever topic I've been thinking about over the years, it always comes back to how do you conceptualize God, right? Especially with the zakah stuff, with the salah stuff that I used to work on a lot more directly. When you peel back all of the layers, it all comes down to what you're going to do with those things. Comes down to who was the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? What was this revelation exactly, right? What is its nature? And then basically, how do you understand God? Yeah. So at the fundamental level, see, even something like God exists as a statement, in one sense, is true. Interestingly, in the Revelation, there's no phrase, yeah, to my knowledge, right, that kind of says that. This phrase, even, because if you say God exists, what, like as if that couldn't be the case, right? Number one. Another then related to this, what I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I've kind of shifted on, and I feel like has internalized for me slightly differently, which is a really important issue or question, I think, which is to say, well, I'll ask you, right? Is God a being, or is God being, capital B? Does God exist, or is God existence,
Mhm.
capital E, if you want to say?
Yeah.
Now, if it is the case, if we argue that God is not a being, but God is being, capital B, or God is existence, capital E, as opposed to an existent thing, then you can see why God exists doesn't quite work in quite the same way, because in a way it's like a dumb question. It's like, I'm not making a comment on you, but you see
Yeah.
or it ceases to be a relevant question, a helpful question, because as opposed to what exactly? Oneness, I think, is relevant. But then you see, or what are you saying? Is reality a unified whole? Yes.
Mm.
So in that sense, yes. Right. But I think what's underlying, well, yeah, either it's direct, I don't know how to the extent you were thinking about it in relation to the question, but certainly a spin-off point in this question, which I think is a really important thing, is this question of, is God a being or is God being?
Mm.
Because that really shifts how you relate to everything,
Mm.
your immediate environment, your day to day, like to the extent of one or
Yeah.
the other, and it can relate to notions of personal or impersonal
Yeah.
in relation to the divine. And that's another really good one in terms of like, it's not an either or. I would say it's a both and, but it's a both and in such a way that's not as much related to what is true in some sense, but it's also so much related to because of this participatory thing, like where we're at.
Mm.
In a certain context, it might feel absolutely inappropriate to conceptualize God in a personal sense in relation to the thing that's being thought of, because it's ending up in a weird kind of outcome or a strange kind of outcome. Sometimes with God God relates to in a more personal way, right? Leads us to say things about what God is up to or doing or intending or what God should or shouldn't do, which ends up being our projection onto this super person. And that can be problematic, obviously. But when it's impersonal, it's in some ways safer in that you don't necessarily affirm something which isn't, or say something positive about God which is not appropriate, but it can feel a bit
Mm.
unrelatable. That also has its, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a both, and again, really interesting in the Revelation, you have both of these coming strongly, right? Like again, this is part of a cornerstone issue, which I think then everything else connects to, which is that
Mm.
if we are mostly conceiving of or relating to God individually and collectively as God up there in the beyond, as opposed to the immanent God, like within or immediate, yeah, on the one hand, and also the God who spoke back then, but doesn't speak in quite the same way now, right?
Mm.
Both of these things I kind of would challenge. So I have a different conception of like the idea of wahi or inspiration or revelation, therefore what the Quran is, how it came about, what accounts for its nature, therefore how we relate to it, how do we relate to the prophetic example, etc. And then and all of these questions, like I have different perspectives and views on now compared to what I had before. But a lot of that is related to the starting point, in which I personally now see much more as,
Mm.
if God is completely outside of his creation, so where does God end and the creation begin? You've got a problem of
Mhm.
finiteness and all sorts there.
Mm.
So there's a much more interlocking thing going on. And therefore, the way we then think
Mm.
about it and the way we convey it and we feel it and we experience it and we think about solutions and we think about all these qualities as well of like truth and wisdom and goodness and all of these things, the way we start to frame all of these things, I think becomes a bit different,
Mm.
or maybe radically so.
Okay. Okay. So that was quite a bit
Yeah.
long, long answer to a very simple, straightforward question.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's funny. No. It's funny because, and I hope you don't take this in the wrong way, but the way you were explaining God and being, a being versus being, or existence, capital E versus exists, it almost sounded like Jordan Peterson, who who is notoriously known for never answering a
Hmm.
question in a straight manner. And
Yes,
I
I've been
think one
told
of my,
that. I've been told that by a couple of close friends as well. And I'm not trying to obviously model myself on him, but I actually I have a lot of respect for what he was trying to do and a lot of what he has achieved. I know that he has done and said things which are also kind of feel strange and inexplicable. But overall, I don't think it's an understatement to say that he has been a massive contributor to the change or a shift in culture away from the very dark place where it was going into, which was a hard atheism, a total nihilism, and everything else. One of the few voices who, at least in some way, was starting to make the case again for some kind of reasonable faith that would be in a new civilizational story. Now, within that, there would be all sorts of like problems and issues and what have you, fine. But the reality is, look, at the end of the day, theological questions are not easy. So when he's asked, and I actually, increasingly over time, I understood why he would maybe give not so straight answer to certain types of questions. So just two examples quickly. One is, do you believe in God? And he would hesitate on that for a long, long time. But when he would explain why he would hesitate, like it actually was quite moving, because a big part of his hesitation, and it seemed very sincere in the way he said it, was the fact that is like, do you realize what a claim it is to say that you believe?
Mm.
Right? In a way, actually, answer was more reflective of the kind of thinking that we should be having about Iman. It's exactly that verse at the end of Surah Al-Hujurat. Yeah, قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. right? The Bedouins say we have believed or we have faith. Say, no, don't say you have faith. Say you've submitted, which in that context kind of suggests, meaning you've just gained initial entry. You just basically affirmed externally, actually. Yeah. And iman, وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ, and true faith has not yet entered your hearts. In a sense, his answer as we said, I remember thinking about that verse when he was explaining. There's one video particularly I remember, which was really quite moving. Now, that's one. The other thing is in relation to certain stories. As a matter of historical fact, it relates to the earlier discussion. As a matter of historical fact, did Jesus rise from the dead? Right? He refused to answer the question. And partly, if you understand his bigger model, yeah? Okay, think about Quranic stories. Yeah? Did this really happen? Someone wants to know, did the sea really part? Did Abraham really enter into a fire? Like if I was there and looking at it, did Abraham really get into the fire? And did it really look like it was burning him? But in reality, it really wasn't burning him. Okay. Now, but again, see the thing, I think the reason why he would refuse to answer these kinds of questions, because the wrong question. That's not, his point would be, I think, the sooner you start to ask this kind of question around these kinds of stories and historical happenings, you've missed the whole point. Right. And these Quranic stories, and it's obviously this is a discussion debate. Maybe again in future discussions we'll come on to this in more detail and actually look at them maybe. But for me, it's no. What's the story doing for you? What are you getting from the story? It's not like miracle stories, or was it really miracle or not? Okay, really? Over time, I thought to myself, like, who cares, man? Like, show me what you're doing in your life differently now as a result.
Yeah.
So I think it partly goes hand in hand with this kind of approach that I described earlier, that you're circling the truth. You're always circling.
Cool. No, I appreciate that. So, I think for the average person, even myself included, we really appreciate simplicity and clarity. And that could be to one's own detriment in terms of the binary stuff we were talking about earlier. We like things to be clear, black and white, The spectrum, the gray area almost makes us uncomfortable, especially when it questions some of the most fundamental things that we, claim to believe in, whether it's in relation to God or in relation to, oh, I'm a Muslim, they're not a Muslim, So, but, I understand what you're saying to a certain extent about this, about how to answer questions about God. You also mentioned this one thing, which is interesting, that I can't remember who it was that came up with this. I can't even remember what the term is, but essentially defining God or referring to God by what he is not in the negation, not in the affirmation, which is safer, because to attribute imperfection from God or say he's not something is safer, right? To then affirm, you kind of know who or what or how God is.
Yeah, that's called apophatic theology.
Okay.
Apophatic. Yeah, Apophatic. Apophatic. So the idea the idea there is essentially like to say what God is not.
Yeah.
Or which is useful, by the way, for even the phrase La ilaha illallah.
Yeah.
To me, over time, what I've realized is that, okay, if you want to, again, to the extent that you want to internalize that, what's the easiest way to internalize this over time, or one of the best ways, in my opinion, is to constantly pay attention to the objectives of our desire or actual pursuits, which are definitely not Allah. Well, we know that's not Allah. We know that's not God. We know that's not the divine. We know that's not ultimate reality. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea is just keep clearing. Okay, keep clearing that out. Keep clearing that out. Keep clearing that out. So those cease to become primary objectives of our desire or pursuit. So when I say desire or pursuit, I mean in terms of from an emotional or longing standpoint, and from an actual how am I spending my time and energy standpoint. What am I attending to? What am I giving my attention to?
Right.
And in a sense, the La ilaha is set up in that kind of way, right? In a kind of negation, and then a sort of a kind of an affirmation. Yeah. But I think the point being is that once all the things are cleared off, all that's left is Allah, the divine, ultimate reality, God, whatever. So, so I think that even on an experiential, practical way, like people often ask this question: how do I know, or how can I purify my intention, or how do I know that I did it for the sake of Allah? Yeah, they want to know about the purity of their intention. Well, that's a harder question to answer, but an easier question to answer is what came into your mind as to what was your motive? What do you think your motivation might actually have been otherwise? Yeah, actually, maybe I did do that because partly was just peer pressure. Partly was a habit, really. Partly was fear, that if I don't, then X, Y, Z, right? partly was because I did want to gain something, be seen a certain way, etc. So I think that's, you know what I mean? So I think
Yeah.
really practical. Okay, I mean, frankly, I don't. You refer to yourself and the average person. I would put myself. I'm putting myself in the same bracket because I feel honestly like the more you explore and learn, right, and the more material and the more work of philosophers, mystics, saints, sages, right, and scientists and experts in various fields that you come across, you just realize like you forget average. You feel I often on a day-to-day basis I feel very much below average myself. So yeah, and I'm trying to. I think part of it is to try to, like I have in mind, certainly when I am, just for my own clarity, right? It's like, yeah, could I explain this to my older kids, right? Could I explain this to like
Yes.
it just
Yes.
whatever I'm trying to explain? Obviously, when I'm speaking with you,
Yeah.
obviously it's hard to move registers all of the time, right? But that's why this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
easier in one sense because, well, yes, you are the chosen representative of society at large for now.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I literally that was on my mind, and this is something I do when I'm teaching or writing myself is I imagine that I'm speaking to my 11-year-old daughter and explaining something to her. Because I know that if I can explain something in a manner that she understands, pretty much any other person can understand. And I almost feel like that's the approach one should take in general, because I would say 95% or even more than 95% of people, that's what they need and what is sufficient. So go back to one thing that you mentioned. We keep referring to God, and we were talking about, oh, God, being, existence, etc. But maybe with the remainder of the time that we have in this session, I want to understand, like, who or what is God? How do you define God? Like, if let's say one of your children or a child was to come up to you and say, who is God? What is God? Tell me what would your answer be? Without going too long, I just want to keep it as concise as possible.
Okay, but if you're going to ask me how I tell a child, that's a big difference, right?
So
Then
let's do both
how I
then.
speak to
Let's
you.
do both.
Well, okay, maybe we'll come back to kids, right?
Well,
I
just
will,
well, sorry, Iqbal, just to
go
push
on.
back on that, again, just to the point I made is that I believe that the average person, especially today in a very complicated world, just needs a simple, direct answer and approach, right? So, like, the way you would explain it to a kid is probably the best way you should explain it to anybody, even an adult, no matter what age. So, if you can try, I don't know if you're able to look at it through that lens and answer the question. Obviously, if you want to go deeper after that, that's fine. But I just want to see what would be the simplest way you could explain this concept of God.
Honestly, like really sincerely and honestly, I believe silence is the best response to that question. Like I really feel that. Like I'm not saying that as a get out clause or a cop out thing or because of some quote I read. Like, like that's the ultimate source of wonder. And when we have wondrous experiences or experiences of awe, typically experiences of awe are accompanied with silence, like just an appreciative silence. And whatever you're feeling there, do you know what I mean? That's the thing. So I know that it's almost like, yeah, just so, and then from there, if we want to say, okay, the sustainer, and the beginning and end of all things, the unity or the one behind all of the multiplicity and the many. I don't know if this works for a child. You can tell me, but it's borrowed from a couple of major figures in the Christian tradition. God is the circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere.
Are you getting emotional at answering this question?
Well, to a certain degree, yeah. As much as I will, as much as I'll let it out in, in this conversation. But here's look at the end of the day, like look at some of the Quranic phrases, right? The ones I've been certainly paying more attention to recently. It's like even they elude you. You see, you know what it's saying, but you don't know what it's saying, right? فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. Now, if I tell my kid that, they'll know what it's saying. They won't know what it's saying. You know what it's saying, but you also don't know what it's saying.
Mm-hmm.
This is why, but what do you get from that? You see, this is why I'm saying the feeling. I think why can't we answer these questions with less propositional, rational statements? Yeah. There's a place for rational theology, right? Analytic philosophy. Well, frankly, gets a bit dry. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I don't, and it doesn't like, the thing is, I think it only matters to the extent that it leads to emotion. Like if we're not getting emotional in discussing this topic, like we've just completely lost the point. Completely lost the point of it, frankly. So yeah, so wherever you turn, there is a face of God, right? The one I just covered in a recent class in Club Revelation. You وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ وَنَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. We created the human being. We know what his or her self whispers to him or her. Like even that, right? Before you get to the next part, like even that, it's okay. Like that's saying, so your every internal thought and feeling is being captured real time. And it's kind of like, okay, well, where is God in order to be able to do that? Oh, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. We're closer to the human being than their jugular vein. So how can God be close in the jugular vein? Okay, fine. From a kind of, if you now want to get into the rational theology part, you'll have all these statements kind of, but so, I don't know, as soon as you start to explain it, like you're ruining it,
Yeah.
Like don't
That's
explain
right.
your joke. I know, okay, in your case, sometimes you have to explain your jokes to me. I don't get them. Yeah. But I'm saying, you have to explain the joke, man. What is the point? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like or art, yeah, or a movie. It's like, I love movies, as you know, right? I don't like discussing movies. I don't like discussing them. Like it's like either you know or you don't know. Like you got it or you didn't get it. Okay, like there's nothing to talk about here. Okay,
Yeah.
you can't capture like because it just words feel like insulting almost sometimes. What about this other one in chapter 8? Okay, you who believe, respond to God and the messenger when he calls you, when he invites you to that which gives you life. يا أيها الذين آمنوا استجيبوا لله والرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم واعلموا أن
Mm.
الله يحول بين المرء وقلبه. Know that God
Mm.
passes between, hovers between a person and their heart.
Mm.
I mean, this is very like, I didn't say that. Okay, like that's there. It's so interesting. Obviously, like in terms of the, yeah. So anyway, you have all these, right? So the idea got and so other ones, for example, okay, you have wa'tasimu bihablillah, right? Cling to the rope of God. Again, people are quick to go, oh, yeah, what does that mean? Oh, and they want a literal, like a one-time definition. No, just leave that aside for a second. Don't have to straight away tell me, oh yeah, the hablullah is the Quran. Well, no, because then he would just say wa'tasimu bil kitab, wa'tasimu bil Quran, right? So using a very particular phrase, right? A very
Mm.
unusual phrase. So let's look at it as it is for a second without having to close it off. It's a frame closure because that can mean and feel so many different things. Now, if you're somebody who, for example, you've ever done some kind of climbing with a rope, yeah, you're going to feel that differently. Okay, you're going to feel what that means differently. Actually, not too long ago, I was in a place where in the middle of I don't even know how to call it. Yeah, I was in Oman, and I had the opportunity to go to one of these wadis, right? And there was an opportunity in one place where you could basically, there was a rope hanging, and you could climb up the rock, and then from there you could dive in, right? Which I did a couple of times, and actually I lost my phone at the bottom of the sinkhole. I was underneath this thing. Anyway, separate issue. But the feeling of climbing there, you're gripping, you're holding, you're pulling, right? There's a real sense. You can really feel that. Okay, now that says there. Now that's in that chapter. I think that's the third chapter. But elsewhere, at the end of Surah Hajj, you have wa'tasimu billah.
Mm.
Not cling to the rope of God. Cling to God.
Mm.
I can hold on to God. Yeah. Literally embrace. Huwa mawlakum. He's your protector. But then at the same time, you know that this is undefinable, right? There's no being there. Now there's so many phrases in the Revelation, not just in the Quran, but in many different scriptures, traditions, etc. This issue is a perennial, timeless, universal problem. Yeah. How do you describe the indescribable? How do you capture that uncapturable? Right. That's why it's attributed to Rumi as this quote that the language of God is silence. All else is poor translation. You want to know my aqidah? That's my aqidah, right? That's my belief right there. That's my theology. That's just so true. You know, what? Okay, tell you, what are you going to say? Like, if you have the vision, if you have the vision of God in the here, in the next life, okay, what are you going to say? Probably not a lot. You're just going to be like dumbstruck.
Yeah.
That's it, dumbstruck.
Yeah.
So yes, but I think actually, like all of these different, some combination of these, you want to say something that leaves people. We like this episode. You want to say something that hopefully leaves people wanting the next one. Okay, it's like, well, that's just with this, where we're just dudes trying to just, like, again, this is a Rumi thing, like ants on the Persian rug, yeah. Like trying to figure out the beauty of this whole thing, but we just realize we need to be hovered up so we can see what's going on. But you want people to you want to say something that leaves people searching, yearning, feeling, longing.
Mm.
That's what. So whatever answer gives that, depending on who it is, that's what you want to say.
Yeah, it's beautiful. There are a couple of other verses that come to mind that in addition to those that you mentioned, like وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ, which is a classic one. Even, of course, to Moses and Aaron,
He's with you
he
wherever you
says,
are.
لَا تَخَافَا. Yeah. لَا تَخَافَا إِنَّنِي مَعَكُمَا أَسْمَعُ وَأَرَى. And then you have, like, after the verse of Ramadan.
Well, you need to translate.
What either?
I'm a stickler for translation.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I'm with you both. Don't be afraid. I'm
mhm.
with you both. I hear and I see.
Yes. Yeah. So even trying to even make sense of that, like I am with you wherever you are. And then also the verse after the verse of Ramadan, when my servants ask you about me, then I am near, inni qareeb, you know? So yeah, I mean, I appreciate you answering that question. At the very beginning, you mentioned the source and the
Sustainer.
sustainer,
The beginning and the end.
and then the beginning and the end. So yeah, I mean, that was a beautiful answer. And I also appreciate the fact that you referenced many Quranic verses to explain your answer of why silence would be the best answer. Because I think sometimes people might think of yourself as someone who's like, oh, well, things are so clear in Revelation, in the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Why is Iqbal going into all this, like, oh, philosophy and all this, like, other stuff? But then when you bring it back to the Quran, and it's like, wow, like his answer is based on what you just explained and the verses you mentioned in the Quran, because it's like, wow, like we almost miss the point sometimes, or don't even think about these things. But even as you were saying, like all of these verses like brought up so many emotions for me, and thinking about my relationship with God and where he is, who he is in my life. So anyway, yeah, just thanks for presenting that.
No, sure. And I think, but in contemporary terms, because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, with the universal kind of considerations in mind, and I think, okay, I'll mention this point now. Again, we may end up having to pick it up next time. But I think there's another important point here. I think that, yeah, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that the words in the revelation in the Quran, in the what I feel sometimes is useful to call the Muhammadan messages, yeah, the words in these verses, they are also ayat. They don't close the story. They don't end the story. Not everything that can and should be said about the divine is captured there. Now, to some people, that's like, oh, that must be like some sort of like heresy or blasphemy. But again, think about how can it be, right? Because if the divine is a source of all languages, and like that thing I said earlier, right? Whose center is who's the circle whose center is everywhere, but whose circumference is nowhere, right? I think we get the point. Yeah, that phraseology is in a different tradition. Originally was written in probably Latin or something. I don't know, right? Okay, and there's tons of stuff. Like when you actually read about the speculations on ultimate reality in all different traditions, beautiful things come out, complete but different, but very different things.
Yeah.
And you see that there is a resonance. You see there's an alignment and overlaps, right? But it's a different phraseology, it's a different type of thing. Different languages affect. Well, the structure of different languages is so very different, right? That they affect the way people think in the first place about certain things completely. Like just conceptually, the whole conceptual world is kind of quite different sometimes. So anyway, my point being, I think is just say it's two things. Number one, I think what's contained in the revelation, first and foremost, contains the most appropriate combination of phrases or descriptions of the divine that the initial recipients required, right? That's why some aspects of the framing of the divine, which contemporarily many people have a problem and difficulty with, which they might call more in the personal anthropomorphic style, or more crudely nowadays people would describe as the man in the sky god, which is what people have a problem with, the one who's up there determining things, and but that's very much a being up there type of conception, which is there in the revelation and has its place, but again, has its place relative to what is true, or has its place relative to how we might need to conceptualize at certain times to afford us the kind of alignment or engagement that we need at that time, depending on where we're at. Okay, now if we're going to speak about the divine in the public sphere in our time, in our context, part of the consideration, not all, but part of the consideration, this again goes back to all that participatory stuff, etc. Part of the consideration of how we speak about the divine has to, in order to be wise and fitted and relevant, has to relate to where are people at. So if, for example, someone relates to the idea of source consciousness, yeah, or ultimate consciousness, or all consciousness as part and parcel of which I'm an individuated piece of that consciousness, okay? Now that's a phraseology that you're not going to find explicitly directly like in Arabic, in say, Revelation or a prophetic kind of tradition per se, but is also, I would suggest, not something which is wholly wrong. It doesn't, again, capture everything, but it's not wholly wrong. And there's a relatability of it, right, that someone can connect with. There's one guy who has a Substack and whose stuff I came across at some point last year, and he doesn't refer to God, he doesn't refer to religion, he doesn't say I'm a Christian, I'm this, that, I don't know what he is, right? All his stuff is about being out in nature, and he's had these nice quips, okay, about just being in nature. Like this one I really loved, which I try to adopt for myself sometimes, which is that he just took this picture of this massive canyon or something, or forest, or wherever he was at, and he was basically like, welcome to my office. Like this is because he's basically like a backpacker and whatever. This is my office. So this kind of, but always, yeah, or like oftentimes, and even in his books that he's written, he always refers to infinite intelligence. He has this absolute conviction in this idea of an infinite intelligence that from which he can download all of the time. His name, if anyone's interested, I haven't followed for a while, but his name is Scott Stillman. Okay, Scott Stillman. You can find him on Substack. I have no affiliation. I haven't met the guy or nothing, but I just remember it just came to mind. Came to mind from Ultimate Mind. So yeah, like, okay, so interesting. This starts to bridge us onto another thing, which may be for the future as well, which is like, well, again, who believes and doesn't believe? Like, is this guy a believer? Feels like one to me. Like he's literally had that direct sense. And I think in a way, like that real, the felt presence of the divine, yeah, is one of surely a higher up indicator, or an more ultimate indicator, and the continuity of that presence, on that sense, on that felt presence, which again is a very prophetic thing. That very famous phrase about even when asleep, right? My eyes sleep, my heart doesn't sleep. So it's that level of felt presence, okay, in the heart, and that connection, okay, which is like an ongoing type of thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's just to say that the way that we speak about the divine, the way we reference the divine, think about the divine, is going to be part and parcel of, needs to be also part and parcel of our cultural reality. And part and parcel of what makes it authentic or true or wise is just to be reflective of the situation that we're in. We have to get good at talking about God in English because we speak English. We're in English speaking environments. We will not be able to be ambassadors for truth and the divine in a way that heals ourselves and society at large if we just can't speak about the divine in moving ways in English. Okay, that's going to require translation. As soon as we're translating, as you well know, as soon as we're translating from whatever source we're taking from, you're already in interpretation straight up. Yeah, right? A great example earlier, I've been thinking about this recently. If I say Wahy's revelation, it brings a whole different vibe. If I say Wahy's inspiration, brings a whole different vibe. Right? But both are reasonable and fair. Anyway, yeah.
Cool. All right, well, to conclude this episode, I would say there's definitely many questions that we'll be discussing in the upcoming conversations, one of which is to delve deeper into the concept of God. You mentioned that other traditions, others in general, have described God in different ways, or described, like, even you gave this example of infinite intelligence from one individual. So it would be nice to explore and see how others have spoken or are speaking about God. I think that would be very fruitful. We can also continue to explore, of course, like God through the Quran or through our, the Islamic tradition specifically as well, how it relates to others. Definitely, I think number two is like labels. We talked about labels at the very beginning, and I want to explore that more as well in terms of Muslim, not Muslim, believer, not believer, and also labels in terms of labeling not just ourselves but things. I think once again, labels are things that as human beings we need labels, right? To be able, like you said, to categorize things, to identify things. And so I do have a bit of an issue when people today, those who we know believe in God, but they don't refer to God. They'll say, "Oh, the universe," or whatever you believe in. And I'm like, why don't you just say God? And so I think it's like, are we almost like washing away, or I don't know what the term is, like
Watering down.
watering down, this concept if we're just avoiding the term that everybody is familiar with, or perhaps in my limited knowledge and wisdom, it's actually avoiding that term is actually a better thing because there are certain connotations associated with that term, but you still want people to be able to come closer to believing in that thing without having all this baggage from that term. So I understand there's a lot of things to discuss there, a lot of nuance, but I think that's probably the plan for the next, who knows how many episodes, at least
Okay,
maybe the
fine.
next
But
one
I
or
think
two.
it would be good just to close with, okay, but specifically next time for our chat, it would be good to have 50% of it, let's say, actually structured with something that you say based on the conversation you think is actually the next point where I can think about, okay, actually doing this in more detail. And then we can have, the rest of it, which is a bit more kind of random, let's say. So specifically, what do you want to, what's the question that you want to leave me with, uh, specifically that's coming to your mind right now? I know we haven't necessarily prepared for it in this way, but just what's coming to your mind right now that perhaps we can then become the starting point for the next round.
I mean, I think one of the two things that I just mentioned, I'll leave it to you in terms of which direction you want to go, but either we start from God, which will then take us into labels, or we start from labels, which I think will bring us back to God. So,
Okay.
you know,
Well, okay. It may be better to, yeah, exactly. I mean, look, at the end of the day, this whole thing, okay, in good faith, you might as well call it in God faith,
mm,
because in one sense, and in some sense, I think over time, like you see there's an inseparability between God and good, and that's another whole conversation as well, actually. But yeah, okay, look, well, maybe we'll get into the label thing because then from there we'll go because I did say like 6 weeks ago or so, 8 weeks ago, I did share with the audience or the part of some of my audience on Telegram that I would be doing like a course on this whole Islam and Muslims revealed. And so the
mm,
idea was to but I think in a way, rather than doing a course in that sense, I think we'll maybe do it through these conversations. So I think this will then
sure,
help me. And the idea of that was to make a scriptural, philosophical, and pragmatic case as to why these labels are problematic and the usage of them, the frames that they put us into. And so maybe I'll prepare something like an initial thing on that, and then that might become something for a little while, and then we'll go from there. Yeah, and I think, yeah, everything links back as I said earlier, right? With the zakah stuff, with the salah stuff, the prayer. When you think about universality, you're thinking about all of the fundamental questions. It's always going to come back to how we understand reality, which to my mind is saying the same thing. And al-haq, right? The real, the really real,
yeah,
the only real.
yeah, yeah,
Well, let's finish with this one. There's one thing which is and I know you have to go, but this one, I'm just gonna bring it up because I want to make sure I don't mess up I've got it here, the narration of it, which is in one collection, uh, put under the Bible Ayyam al-Jahiliyyah, the chapter of the days of ignorance, right? Uh, for the sake of the people who are looking for the barak, for the blessing, we'll read it in Arabic, okay? حدثنا أبو نعيم حدثنا سفيان عن عبد الملك عن أبي سلمة عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أصدق كلمة قالها الشاعر كلمة لبيد ألا كل شيء ما خلا الله باطل. So the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said the most true word said by a poet was the words of Labid. He said, verily everything except God is, well, this translation says perishable, but batil just means false.
mm,
Right? In
yeah,
in the Revelation, batil and haqq are the contrasts. So
mm.
yeah, that is all there is in the end. Yep. All right, my friend. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I hope it was beneficial for you, and I hope it will be beneficial for others. And yeah, I look forward to. I am excited about the next round. All right, take care.
Same here. You too. All right. Peace.
Peace, brother.